Well, settle in. We're going to see if I can set a new record for how long I talk around a game before I get to the actual game. Heroes of the Lance is the intersection of a whole lot of rather complicated topics. And as much as I'm harshly editing myself to get to the point, I've still got a lot of ground to cover. So step 1, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to assume that most people watching this video are familiar with the concept of Dungeons & Dragons, especially in this era when anyone who plays puts their game sessions on the internet. But in 1984, TSR, the makers of Dungeons & Dragons, were aggressively looking for new ways to expand the line. And one of the options that they chose was a new setting by Tracy Hickman that was intended to put the emphasis on the dragons. That setting is Dragonlance, and besides the large hardcover rulebook that described the setting for players, they also made a series of 16 modules that were strongly narrative-driven and formed a campaign covering the whole setting. The modules were based on the same campaign that would be turned into a weirdly successful series of fantasy novels. Now we jump ahead a few years. Strategic Simulations Incorporated was a US video game publisher who throughout the 80s were almost entirely focused on war games. But at the end of the decade, they became the first company to get a license to make official Dungeons & Dragons games. The RPG was 15 years old at that point, and a lot of early computer RPGs took direct inspiration from it, if not outright ripping it off. So someone finally being able to make real Dungeons & Dragons games for the computer was a really big deal. And SSI's initial plan was to create 2 lines of Dungeons & Dragons games. Ones that were standard computer RPGs, and ones that were action games. The action game line was the Silver Box series. And look, the Famicom version of Heroes of the Lance has a silver box. It's actually identical to any of the computer game boxes, except for the Famicom and Pony Canyon logos. For the first game in the Silver Box series, SSI decided to adapt the most popular piece of D&D media at the time, which would be the novels based on the modules. But even one of the books would be too sprawling for a single game, and so Heroes of the Lance adapted the dungeon from the first module, Dragons of Despair. To actually make the game, SSI turned to British developer US Gold. And if you're familiar with them, alarm bells just went off. I believe that Heroes of the Lance and its sequel are the only US Gold games released on the Famicom. They did a lot of ports of these same games that we've been seeing over the years to British microcomputers, often with very poor quality. US Gold made the original computer versions and ported that around to quite a few places, but when it came time for a console release, they handed off their design to a team that knew what they were doing, Natsume. And to Natsume's credit, this is a very accurate port of the computer game, but that is not a point in its favor. The Famicom version was published by Pony Canyon. At this point they had basically shifted over to specializing in publishing Famicom versions of computer games, and they published 4 of SSI's Dungeons & Dragons games on the system. However, it's not the same 4 Dungeons & Dragons games that Pony Canyon published for the NES in the United States. The US was spared Dragons of Flame, and got a version of Dragon Strike instead, which wasn't actually a port of the computer game Dragon Strike. Getting to the plot of Heroes of the Lance is also a bit tough. The story is the foundation of an entire Dungeons & Dragons setting. But to trim it down as far as I can take it, the gods abandoned the people of Krynn, and so clerical magic stopped working. But now it's coming back. One woman has an artifact of the gods that lets her cast spells, and she's been instructed by a divine voice to return it to an ancient ruin. Her and her guardian met a bunch of other people in a bar, and they decided to form an adventuring party to go do this. The 8 party members are all characters from the books, and I'll spare you the introduction to each of them. It also saves me from having to go over some of the more problematic aspects of certain ones. And we will finally get to the actual game. And Heroes of the Lance is a side-scrolling action game. Sometimes as you're walking around, the compass at the bottom of the screen will light up to indicate that you could take a path from where you are. The compass is also supposed to help keep you orientated, but from direct experience, trying to map out the game world will give you a headache. When you hit up and down, you're essentially rotating 90 degrees. And then you're in an intersecting hallway or room, but you only have that narrow slice of it. And so there isn't really a sense of space here. Hitting select will bring up this menu. Here you can switch around your party order, cast mage or cleric spells, use items in your inventory, take items that you find around the dungeon, hand them between characters, drop them back on the floor, see how many monsters you've killed and any experience that you've earned. You don't level up in the game, you just get points. And you can choose to save or load at any time. Heroes of the Lance has 3 battery save slots for you to use. The party order matters a lot. Whoever is in the upper left position is who your active character is. Typically you'll want someone with high strength so that they can hit things, and good armor. Whoever's in the second slot, just to the right of that, could also get hit by enemy attacks. The wizard and cleric have to be in that top row of characters in order to cast their spells in combat. So generally you're going to want them in the 3rd and 4th position. Everyone else just kinda hangs out. The number of spells that you have access to is pretty limited, and rather than having spell slots, your spellcasting characters have essentially magic points. They can't recover these during the game though, so it pays to be cautious with them. The spell list for both cleric and wizard are really truncated. Basically, 8 spells for each of them. For the wizard, it's mostly ranged attacks, and for the cleric, it's mostly healing. Casting spells requires that you go into the menu, go into the submenu for whose spells you're going to cast, pick the spell, then back out of all the menus again, and then you see the effect of the spell. It is non-intuitive. When you encounter a creature, the word combat will appear below the compass, and that means that the B button will now work to swing your weapon. Your lead character will swing whatever weapon you have equipped, and do so continuously for as long as you hold down the B button. For short enemies like these dwarves, you have to press diagonally down while you're attacking in order to swing at their level. Some characters have ranged weapons. You have to specifically use these from their inventory, and then if you hold down the B button without pressing a direction, they'll break out their special weapon. You have unlimited arrows, but for things like spears, you only have one shot, and will have to pick it up again after you throw it. Something important to be aware of is that despite being an action game, Heroes of the Lance follows Dungeons & Dragons rules. In other words, when you swing a sword in proximity to someone, it rolls a 20-sided die in the background to determine whether or not you hit them. That also means that your characters tend to be very fragile. The warrior characters typically have under 40 hit points, and some monsters can do over a dozen points of damage in an attack. That also means that certain weaker characters could easily be killed with one blow. It creates a situation in Heroes of the Lance where typically it's better to just run away from enemies. They will chase after you into other rooms, but you can outpace them and it's not like you're going to level up. The A button can do some maneuvering for you. Holding A and pressing down will duck momentarily, while holding A and pressing in an upward diagonal direction will make the character jump. Well, except for the wizard, he kinda floats around for a bit. There is platforming in the game, but the edges of holes are so poorly defined, and your jumps tend to be pretty stubby, so encountering a hole that you want to jump over means that you really should save right then. If a character does die in combat, you can cast Raise Dead on them before you wander off from that area, but if they die by falling down a hole, they're gone forever. The game is over when all 8 members of the party are dead. Heroes of the Lance is not well regarded in Japan, and that's putting it mildly. I think I saw more hostility toward this game than any in quite a while. Comments like, "I threw it across the room," and "I had better things to do with my life than play it." And in case you can't tell, I really hate Heroes of the Lance. I'm not sure how many days I spent trying to get through the Commodore 64 version before I finally came to the realization that the problem wasn't me, it was that the game really was that bad. The controls are terrible, and the dungeon exploration is even worse. the world is virtually unnavigable. The combat demonstrates why you can't have AD&D combat in a real-time game, and the whole thing is just an unplayable mess. And the scary part is, the sequel's even worse. Or at least it is on computers. The comments from Japanese players say that they found it to be easier, though that doesn't mean it will wind up being good. But as for Heroes of the Lance, playing it is a real act of self-harm. Just don't do it. There's so many better things you could do with your life.